Okay, thank you. I mentioned to Dr. Orlowski personally that I was very appreciative of his presentation. I thought it was outstanding. And one thing that particularly piqued my interest was the material you gave us regarding Theodore of Mopsuestia and the question of the sacrifice as an immolation. Whereas he uses that term, he also talks about it being a commemoration of the cross. So there's not, it seems to me, at least in the snippet you gave us, there's not any suggestion of a re-sacrifice. But there does seem to be some sort of an appreciation for the fact that this is the sacrifice, the sacrificed, immolated body and blood of Christ. And so I was very intrigued by that. In fact, there's a professor down in Texas somewhere, Roman Catholic, by the name of Caresti, Rock Caresti, I think is his name, who tries to bridge the gap between the Lutherans and the Roman Catholics on this question. And I wonder if Theodore of Mopsuestia could help us there, because we've missed the boat, I think, in our knee-jerk reaction against calling the sacrament a sacrifice, because of our knee-jerk reaction against Rome and the idea of an unbloody sacrifice and a re-sacrifice and all that sort of thing. We've failed to recognize the fact that the sacrament is the sacrifice of Christ given to us, and that's why we still use altars. So I wonder if you'd like to respond to that, because I was particularly enamored with that.
Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you for that. In fact, this came up in my dialogue with the Catholics that I'm involved in. We have the one where I went to the Vatican, yes, but there's also another one too at the ECT, the group that meets in New York with the First Things. I don't know if you're familiar with that group. But we've developed a trust between the evangelicals and the Catholics, and we talked about this issue. And I asked my Catholic bishop on the other side, I said, so why do you guys, teach this idea of re-sacrificing Christ? And he says, we don't teach that. And that was news to me. I mean, that was the whole point. I thought there was I didn't know what he meant by that, but he started explaining to me the fact of what they see going on there. And in words that are very similar to Theodore of Mopsuestia's. I mean, that there's not a re-sacrifice going on, but there still is the sacrifice that happened at Calvary, that it's reality again in the church. But of course, in the sense of how Hebrews understands that. So I hadn't read that Theodore text yet, though, when I talked with him, and I thought this would be an interesting way to ask if is this what Catholics really understand by that? Because I think we've caricatured them sometimes, and that's what he said to me. So please.
There's one thing that is commonly said, I don't know how much they say it, but one thing that bothers me is when they talk about an unbloody sacrifice.
Yeah.
Because as far as I'm concerned, it's quite bloody. Yeah. It's the blood of Christ.
Yeah. No, that's right. Yeah, and I think they're just trying to get away from, this idea of we're sacrificing something on the altar. And yet that, you do see that language, though, in the patristics to a certain degree, unbloody sacrifice on occasion. And in the Roman Catechism. In the Roman Catechism, it's there as well. Okay, yeah. So what I find, I was the most unlikely person to have dialogues with Catholics, in one sense, how I started out. But I've learned a lot from the Catholics as far as what they really teach versus what we say they teach, even on the issue of Scripture and tradition, and which I gave that paper on, and justification. Well, there's still some issues with that, I think. But I'm glad that you see that in Theodore, because that's what I saw too when I had come across that text. Theodore is one of these guys who's not that well known, Theodore of Mopsuestia. And the reason he's not known is because he was listed in the 3 chapters that were condemned at the Council of 553, Council of Constantinople II. And so he was condemned along with Theodoret and others. because of this debate with Cyril of Alexandria and Nestorius. If you remember, this is a bit of church history, but Theodore was kind of on the side of Nestorius that way as teacher. So he was one who separated the two, the human person and the logos and the man assumed. And that was, of course, the church ultimately rejected that kind of whole formulation. I could get into a whole other discussion about how, well, I better not. But so I decided, he had a lot to say, and we translated his commentary on John and some other materials. And this, by the way, the thing that I quoted, those catechetical lectures are in the Woodbridge Studies series. But I think he's a good bridge figure myself, so we should read him some more. Oops, sorry.
Thank you. So many questions and so much to ponder in your presentation. As I heard this, there came to mind something that appears, as I'm sure most of you know, at the end of the catalog of testimonies appended to the Book of Concord. If someone has a copy of the Book of Concord with the catalog of testimonies, I would be very grateful if they could bring it to me or just read what I'm going to mention from your place. But at the end of the catalog of testimonies, there's this quotation from St. John Chrysostom, and in the margin it says that this is against the papal or papistic notion of the sacrifice of the Mass. But it's very interesting in that it speaks of how he's talking about the distinction between the one offering of Christ, the many celebrations of the Holy Eucharist, and so forth. And do we have a copy of the Book of Concord here with the catalog of testimonies?
You want me to read it?
Yes, at the end of the catalog, I'd read the marginal note as well.
Since he is offered up in many places, are there many Christs? Not at all. The one Christ is everywhere, being completely here and completely there, one body. Whereas he who is offered in many places is one body and not many bodies, so is he also one sacrifice. He is that high priest of ours who has offered the sacrifice that cleanses us. We also now offer that which, having been offered then, was not consumed. This is done in remembrance of that which was done then. This do, he says, in remembrance of me. For we do not make another sacrifice as the high priest, but always the same. We rather bring about the remembrance of the sacrifice. This quote, I guess it does have to note, this quote is against the propitiatory sacrifice of the Papist Mass.
So what that suggests to me is that for those who prepared the catalog of testimonies, this was an acceptable way of talking about the Eucharist. So I think that's something worth. It sort of ties in, I think, with Theodore of Montsuestia and so forth. So,
in fact, I believe it's in the Apology where they say we can talk about sacrifice.
Yes, in the Apology, in Article 24 of the Apology, there is a discussion of that.
We don't mean this, but we can talk about it in this way. Yeah, so.
The phrase unbloody sacrifice, that is a phrase that has become kind of, excuse the expression, boogeyman in Lutheran circles. And I remember vividly Dr. Peepcorn saying that, it somehow, I think what it suggests, even though it may not say that, it's sort of what we took to be the summary of everything that's wrong in the Roman doctrine of the sacrifice of the Mass, the unbloody sacrifice of the Mass. And yet that phrase, unbloody sacrifice, it does appear in the patristic literature, and it appears in the Eastern liturgy as well. So But I would say, too, that one of the things about Roman Catholic doctrine is that there really isn't a firm agreement on what the sacrifice of the Mass in fact is. There are all kinds of ways of talking about that, and I think even at Trent there were arguments about what the sacrifice was. An interesting sideline is that back in the pre-Vatican II days, when, and to some extent even today, when there was a tremendous argument between Roman Catholics and Anglicans about the validity of Anglican orders. I mean, you may remember that, what was it, 1892, somewhere around there, Leo XIII declared that Anglican orders were absolutely null and utterly void. And popular or prevalent Roman Catholic theology said one of the main reasons for that is that the ordinal was changed in such a way that it didn't talk about, quote, a sacrificing priesthood. A sacrificing priesthood. Well, in the mid-60s, there was a convert from Anglicanism to the Roman Church, a man by the name of John J. Hughes, who wrote a book on the question of the validity of Anglican orders. I believe the title was Stewards of the Lord. And in there, it's interesting that a convert will say this. He says that really, if you just read the texts of the Mass as they stand, there is no place actually where it is said that we offer the body and the blood of Christ. It speaks of offering the host, the cup. And the astonishing conclusion that John J. Hughes comes to is that the only way you can speak of the sacrifice of the Mass, really, is that the prayers are offered, the bread and wine are offered, so forth and so on. And that the priest, I mean, he simply speaks the words of Christ. And the only sense that there's a real sacrifice is that the sacrificed body and blood of Christ are present on the altar. And I think that's pretty much what we would say. And I think John Stevenson's book on the Lord's Supper, he has a very, if someone remembers that more clearly than I do, he too has a very good discussion of that, in which he proposes a formulation. And he objects to the particular Roman Catholic view. He calls it the extra-Romanisticum. Remember that? Anyone who's read Dr. Stevenson? The extra-Romanisticum. So, yes, so there's much. I guess we were speaking about kneelers and weepers and all of that and so forth. And I just have one question that comes to mind, and it's sort of in a way odd, maybe not. But I sometimes think that the only way we will ever resolve this problem of closed communion is to restore the dismissal of the catechumens. You know, all those who are not eligible to receive the sacrament. And of course, in the Eastern liturgy, they still have the liturgy for the catechumens, followed by the catechumens depart, all catechumens depart, none of the catechumens, but only us the believers, again and again, so forth. And I once attended an Orthodox liturgy that an Orthodox priest friend of mine celebrated. And for some reason, I had to leave early. And he said, Charles, I was very amused. You left just as I said, all catechumens depart, catechumens. So anyway, I think I've said about all I should say.
Well, I was thinking we'd still have the exit of the catechumens, but it's in Wisconsin. It was when the Packers played, which is terrible to say. I know. Yeah, I've thought about that. In my dad's church growing up, I think he had a time when people would leave when he started the communion liturgy. That was just how they did it back then in the 60s or early 70s. So I don't know where that, we used to do that, I think, to a certain degree, didn't we?
Yeah, but that was.
Well, no, I know it wasn't the same. I know. I know, but still, nonetheless, you could have used that, right? Yeah, is simply what I'm saying. So forget about the Packers and just, no.
Thank you. Thank you. I'd like to, in further answer to the gentleman that asked the question about where the rubber hits the road on penitence and admission. Penitence and admission. On Maundy Thursday, historically, there were 3 great masses. The last was the Mass of the institution. The second is the Chrism Mass, where the bishop comes and blesses the chrism that's distributed to all the churches from the Basilica. And Zion continues in that tradition. We continue to have a Chrism Mass. The first Mass of the day was the reconciliation of the penitents. And the penitents would come to the front door of the Basilica in sackcloth. And they would lay face down on the pavement, and the bishop would speak to them, admonish them, and then forgive them. And they would vest and then enter, but only into the very back of the nave, where there was a second round of absolution before they were admitted. And this is also in conjunction with the Great Vigil, which is much older than the reconciliation of the penitents, so that those being catechized would be admitted to baptism and then receive Holy Communion for the first time on Easter. So just in follow-up to that.
That's great. Thank
you.
Sure,
yeah. And the language that you heard in the liturgy today, especially about sacrifice, you heard that word a number of times in our liturgy. This is ancient language. It goes back to Hippolytus, it goes back to the apostolic constitutions. And it's not wrong to say that there is a right understanding of Eucharistic sacrifice. We've already spoken about the Eucharist as the center of that. And Father McLean mentioned the offering processional. And we also have this language about all that we are and all that we have as living sacrifices. So this, rightly understood, there's no problem at all with Eucharistic sacrifice.
Well, we do have a knee-jerk reaction to it.
The words make us nervous.
Yeah.
And it is that kind of anti-papistic. I was interested that someone said there was a margin note in the Book of Concord that the editor said that Chrysostom was speaking against a papistic practice. There were no popes in Chrysostom's time.
That's right.
That's a later emendation that's anachronistic.
Thanks. I also want to make a few remarks and throw it back to you regarding penance. The sacrament of penance is really complicated in the medieval Roman Church, and I mean, you can hear in the apology the frustration, because it is deliberately complicated because they're really evil about it and with the sale of indulgences and so forth. They say one thing, they do something else. I think if we go back and we look at the sacrament of, or the idea of penance in the early church, again, recognizing there's lots of things, and we put the best construction on it, my understanding of it, the way it was meant to work was that you get drunk, you slap your wife, you come the next day to the pastor, you confess, you're absolved. They're absolved unconditionally, and then the pastor says, now what can we do to help you so that this doesn't happen again? Here are some spiritual exercises that will strengthen your faith. Say the Lord's Prayer, say that. And, that obviously could easily be abused, and maybe it was never done real well anywhere. But at the same time, I think we ought to be able to recognize that that's a Christian attitude. And I wonder if in some ways, and I'm not casting stones, I mean, I agree with you. I want to tell them they're forgiven. And not only do I think I sometimes have maybe done that a little too quickly and not actually allowed them to confess, but I wonder if it's actually irreverent. That it's actually irreverent towards the offense that has been caused, towards the danger to the community and so forth. That to not take sin seriously is to actually not take forgiveness seriously. And I am definitely of the opinion that the Missouri Synod has a soft antinomian problem. I like that phrase from Mark Serberg. I think that says it well. There is this kind of reveling in the gospel that is irreverent to the gospel because it's cheap in a sense. So I don't know if you want to react to that.
First of all, to say amen to that, of course, Bonhoeffer talks about cheap grace and all that, which I think that's more the reality affecting our church today, rather than people worrying about their sins or their conscience being bound. If anything, their consciences are a little too free. But we recoil at that pretty quickly, saying, you're just, and I don't know if it's because with our Walther law, reading Walther and all that, sometimes he talks about David not being forgiven, he would have been in hell had he not repented. And so we kind of, I don't know, we want to center on the gospel, but we don't understand the gospel is both law and gospel. And I'm not ever saying that the church fathers did it all right. I hope everybody hears that loud and clear. But I am saying I've learned a lot from them by reading them. And what I see them doing is giving me a outside lens. So, from outside our culture, outside our time, to say, as a diagnostic tool, are we really doing things the way we should? And when you see what they were doing, and when they were confronted by many of the same problems, and even worse, frankly, in some ways. Yeah, we have the internet, but they had, the temple prostitutes and all that. So I really wonder if we've taken sin seriously. And so I guess I just would affirm what you say. And I hope we can do that, without going totally the other way. I would think we can. We always get that, don't we? One side or the other. And we pray for divine guidance on that in the Spirit, which I'll talk about tomorrow in my class.
This is I'm going to throw you what I think is a softball. But there's a Fort Wayne professor who really hates Lift Up Our Hearts because it's synergistic. And so he doesn't think it should be in the liturgy. So we shouldn't be lifting up our hearts because that's our action. And also, the whole Lutheran idea is God descends, he comes down, and so forth. So that's all inviting people to sort of speculate and go into mysticism and so forth. So you have a response to that?
It's a lamentation.
Sure. I'd like that. We're gonna do this in
Yeah, right.
chain here, yeah. So in the earliest liturgies, we lift them up is not there. It's echomen. We have them with the Lord, soon with the Lord. And especially in St. James, who someone mentioned earlier. So this translation is not reflective of what the historical liturgies are. Go ahead.
Well, that was going to be part of what I was going to say, that, we have them to the Lord, but the Lord also has them, of course, too. But, I think of Chrysostom on Philippians 2, when he talks about, God is at work in you both to will and to do of his good pleasure, and that even that very lifting up is only enabled by God himself, of course. But that seems like a pretty tough thing to hang your hat on as far as, this. I don't know who the professor is, but that would be where you want to focus. So I simply go to not only that we have them to the Lord, right, but also the aspect of, because the Eastern Church talks a lot about the will, frankly, and they do talk about ascension and things like that. But if you read somebody like Chrysostom, who's in some ways reacting against Alexandria, I suppose, but he'll talk about it. God does everything with your will too. He'll talk about that, and I was very happy to see that because that it is God who is at work in you both to will and to do of his good pleasure. Says that even my will is God's will working in me. So, and he's the one who's lifting up my heart. And frankly, I have trouble leaving behind the things of this world. Every time I hear that, I'm convicted. And I don't want to be convicted. I want to be up there. I want my heart to be with the Lord. And I think that's the whole point. And to me, I just get frustrated when that gets cut out of the liturgy because I'm missing that. And I haven't had that reminder to me to have my heart with God. So that's how I see it.
I'm going to do a time check real quick, but I think we do have a little bit of time for questions. Yes, we do in 10 minutes.
Okay.
So if there are any
Ask these guys
from
questions.
The floor, for any of the gentlemen on the panel, I would certainly take them.
I'd like to return to something.
Okay, Father Eckert wants to continue.
Thinking a little bit more about this distinction between the re-sacrifice and the presentation of the sacrifice. I wouldn't want to say, and I'm sure none of us here would want to say, that we agree with Rome on that, because although there's a lot of language that sounds okay to us, on the other hand, they got this idea that the priest confects the sacrament. And so as he does this, he confects it in two kinds. And as that is done, you have the body here and the blood here, and in some mystical sense, the sacrifice is occurring again. I think there's a right way and a wrong way to look at that. So I just was wondering if you might like to explore that.
Yeah, thanks for that. I mean, I think in one sense, and this is what I would often run across in other discussions as well, we always have to ask them to define terms, and we have to define terms as well. And so, and not only that, I mean, we still have to look at the underlying theology behind everything, and if there still is a sense in which, you know, it is my work that earns my way with God in some shape or form, no matter how all the other things you say, we still have that at the heart and core that we can't let go. And that's why, for instance, I was involved in a dialogue with the Catholics on Mary, okay? It was, I think we titled it, Do Whatever She Tells You, or something like that. And it was part of this Evangelicals and Catholics Together group. Well, this ended up being one of the first times where it was evangelicals and Catholics apart, you know, because of when we started defining terms and trying to figure out what's going on with Mary and what they were teaching, we realized that there was just a point where we could not go, and we had to state that explicitly in the document then too. And a number of people were kind of frustrated and disappointed with that. And I said, no, actually this is a good thing, because we're not saying we're covering over differences. We're not just using terms in whatever way so it'll sound good, but we're actually, we've gotten to the point where we've nailed the head on what's wrong, you know, and that's where we need to have further discussion. And so I think the same thing with, you know, the liturgy of the Eucharist. Before we go and just take lock, stock, and barrel, we would have to talk a lot more, you know. I'm simply saying I think we caricature sometimes what they're saying, and I look to have what I tell my students is a sympathetic but critical ear. And usually we're critical and maybe sympathetic later, you know. And I'm just hoping that we can be more sympathetic, but also, you know, have our antennae up and we know our theology. That's a gift that we have, and we wouldn't want to lose that. So that's kind of how I look at that. You know, you've pointed out another area where we'd have to say, wait a minute, what do you mean by this? And I don't think we can go there.
Just wanted to add a comment. I take Father Eckert's point, but I think in fairness to our Roman brethren, we also have to remember that according to their teaching, the priest, in speaking the words of consecration, acts in persona Christi.
Yeah.
He's acting in persona Christi.
Right.
He's simply the instrument for that. So I think that's something worth thinking about. On the Sursum Corda thing, it suddenly occurred to me that the Greek, the Latin response to Sursum Corda is, we have them to the Lord. Habemus ad Dominum. So it's interesting, but I do find it curious. I think I know who the professor is. I won't say, but I've read enough. But it strikes me as very odd to find something that venerable in the liturgy to be somehow some kind of source of distortion. I think you can press a point so far that
I mean, I think this is not, I'm not speaking out of school. I mean, this, Dr. Masaki is, you know, this is public, and I mean, he's not being irreverent or disrespectful. He's just raising the point. But what he is concerned about is that this is a point of law in the liturgy, and he really wants the liturgy to be all gospel. And he always brings up that this is what it should be. So, I mean, he has a point. My kind of reaction to it, though, is that actually the liturgy serves to keep us from going too far. And I think that, I do think that actually C.F.W. Walther's, the publication of those theses after he died, an old man's dying lectures to these students because he didn't trust them to preach, and then we take it as a dogmatics text and we exaggerate it, and then we use that's the lens by which the liturgy is judged, and we become actually possibly sectarian and antinomian. Whereas I think that the liturgy kind of gives us a fullness, and it kind of reins us in, and maybe it actually keeps us Christian. We say that often about Luther, right? Thank God for the liturgy. It might be true for us. We're so arrogant in thinking, assuming that, of course, we just have this pure gospel, we know what it is. And I'm saying the liturgy saved Luther. Maybe the liturgy is saving us. Maybe we shouldn't muck around with it. There's a kind of sense of reverence that we might be a little too narrow in our understanding of some of this stuff. If that makes sense in a general way.
So the liturgy is a pearl, is that the first use?
Yeah, first use law. And it's probably even a mirror to a certain degree. And a rule, canon. Yeah, there we go, the canon.
If you'd like 3 or 4 minutes for closing comments.
Okay, I can do that. When you first suggested this topic of reverence, there's so many directions you could go in this. And I thought about just the whole aspect of the clergy, too, and you read somebody like Chrysostom's on the priesthood, and talking about what a priest should look like, And my students in class are very interested in that, They want to be true pastors, and they believe the church fathers could tell them something about that. How to be reverent and loving, and also loving with all that means, with law and gospel, with confession, absolution, all of that. And so when I chose to focus on this encounter with God as the King coming to his people, it pretty much was for me suggested by that text from the Didache, and so that's where I went with it. But as I started reading more of these texts, and as I say, I didn't spend much time in the liturgies. I figured everybody knew those pretty well. I focused on the catechetical lectures because I was wondering, what are they saying about the liturgy? What are they teaching, and what are they trying to communicate to their people? And that's, and Cyril of Jerusalem is probably one of the earliest that we have that kind of catechetical lecture, even though the Alexandrian school was around. But I just want to commend you for having a conference like this that is trying to get people to think about, I should say all of you, to think about the liturgy as God's gift to us, that he wants to draw us to himself, and he's given us a wonderful way to do it, and that the church really is much greater than any one of our places or any one of us as people. It really is that Catholic sense of unity that we have in this common liturgy. We can talk about it as much as we can talk about that, but that God comes to serve us. So I'd like to just thank all of you for your kind attention, and again, bring you greetings from Concordia Seminary, and hope to see you again.